Welcome back to our course on conflict of interest for professionals. In this module, we'll talk about conflict of interest and contracting, emerging issues in conflict of interest, how conflict of interest appears in codes of ethics, and go over some possible consequences for mishandling a conflict of interest. One of the major areas where conflict of interest arises is in contracting, and especially in tendering for contracts. In this case, we're mostly concerned with identifying private interests. Managing them is usually either very simple at the tendering stage, your bid is simply disallowed, or not explicitly addressed in the contract management stage. But the issue of identifying conflicts is handled differently by different organizations. Some do not address the issue at all. Others address only one aspect. For instance, federal contracts stress post-employment conflicts of interest, but pay less attention to other aspects. Some try to address most aspects. For instance, see this excerpt from a provincial tender. It reads, conflict of interest includes any situation where the contractor has an unfair advantage or engages in conduct that may give it an unfair advantage, including having access to information that is not available to other contractors, communicating with any person with a view to influencing preferred treatment in the tender process, engaging in conduct that compromises or could be seen to compromise the integrity of the tender process. And the contract's other commitments, relationships, or financial interests could be seen to exercise an improper influence over the objective exercise of its independent judgment, or compromise its contractual obligations. You can see here that the first section does not really deal with conflict of interest. While important, it is actually dealing with fairness. It's the second part where true conflict of interest comes in. Here it talks about commitments, relationships, or financial interests, what we have lumped together as private interests. While this tender never defines these terms, it is clear as trying to address the issue of private interests, and especially the phrase, or could be seen to, which is used twice, highlighting the importance of perceived conflict of interest. The previous example allowed for the identification of conflict of interest. However, that tender never described what would happen in the event that a conflict actually occurred. Nor did it establish an ongoing requirement for the contractor to monitor their work for future conflicts. In reality, such follow-up details are rare. A question now: how does your organization handle conflict of interest with its contractors? Now, dealing with conflict of interest in contracting is pretty old hat. It has been around for a long time. Is there anything new in conflict of interest? Well, yes. Modern business is quite different from what it was years ago. There is more exchange of personnel and matrix organizations. There is more outsourcing. These changes make staff management in all areas, including conflict of interest, more complex. The types of interests employees may hold is also more complex. There are innovative financial instruments that are not explicitly defined in most disclosure policies, and novel ways in which people can become involved in businesses. The concept of a social media influencer did not exist 20 years ago. In the political realm, the proper control of lobbyists is an ongoing issue, as is the interface between elected officials and the public service. And when does sponsoring a public event cross over into an attempt to unfairly influence the event organizers? Whistleblowing also seems to be on the rise, with its inherent conflict of interest of the organization in keeping certain information private, butting up against the public right to know. Lastly, social media complicates the idea of personal interests. On the scale of personal interest, do my social media friends count as much as my in-person friends? If not, how should we account for them? If I like a post, does that mean I am publicly stating an opinion on the issue? Lastly, in emerging issues, we live in an increasingly litigious society. Taking people to court is seen more and more as a realistic option. With this in mind, should you have liability insurance? Most codes of ethics do not require it, although some groups, like certified health and safety consultants, do have such a requirement. What do you think about liability insurance? Is it necessary in conflict of interest situations? Moving away from emerging issues and on to our next associated issue, codes of ethics often address conflict of interest, but often in different ways. For instance, the Board of Canadian Registered Safety Professionals says to avoid conflict of interest. Health and Safety Professionals of Canada says manage them. Engineers Canada likes to strike a middle ground. They give you a choice, avoid or disclose. Which approach do you think is best? And if we're talking about avoiding it, if you were the only person empowered or knowledgeable enough to decide an issue, is avoiding conflicts of interest at all times a reasonable policy? Dealing with codes of ethics and associated rules, I want to discuss some obligations of Canadian Registered Safety Professionals, CRSPs. CRSPs have an obligation to report other CRSPs, that is, in many cases, their friends, to the organization if the friend engages in professional misconduct. The friend is then subject to discipline. You too are subject to discipline if you decline to report your friend. This obligation sets up a conflict of interest. On one side, support the integrity of the BCRSP. On the other, support loyalty to a friend, or even avoid personal discipline. So what are the consequences of failing to properly manage a conflict of interest? We saw in our analysis of the Nova Scotia policy that discipline and possibly termination is one result. In extreme cases, usually involving bribery, the criminal code kicks in. And most codes of ethics see ongoing and unmanaged conflicts of interest as unethical. Now, codes of ethics often have disciplinary procedures. The following discussion of discipline within the BCRSP is simply an example. Now, the BCRSP has established a Professional Conduct Committee. This committee investigates ethics complaints in general, not just conflict of interest. If there is a conflict of interest complaint lodged, it is directed to the Professional Conduct Committee. This committee may dismiss the complaint if they feel it is frivolous, vexatious, or inappropriate. If they do take the complaint, the committee may hold off its deliberations if there is another body, such as an internal review, looking into the matter. Once the committee does start its deliberations, it will inform the accused of the complaint's existence and give the accused 30 days to respond in writing. The committee will then make its decision based on the written record. After deliberating, the Professional Conduct Committee may dismiss the complaint, provide written recommendations, or if they see it as serious enough, refer it to the Discipline Committee. The Discipline Committee will then hear the matter in person and in public. After the hearing, the Discipline Committee may dismiss the complaint. revoke or suspend a certification, issue a reprimand, impose restrictions or conditions, or require further education. And the accused may appeal any decision to the appeals committee. If there is no appeal, the discipline committee's decision is final and is published on the website. Now, this is just one example of how discipline for a conflict of interest violation could proceed. Other associations may have similar or different processes. And that concludes our discussion of conflict of interest. I invite you now to move to Module 10, where we will conclude this course with a discussion about the final quiz.